Welcome to today's webinar, Everything You Wanted to Know About Estimation, but Were Afraid to Ask. It's my pleasure to introduce your speaker today, Mr. Kieran Hanway, Principal Consultant at Kainos Software. Kieran, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jill. Hello, everybody. Dzień dobry. Guten Tag. It's a topic that's kind of close to my heart, this one. Everything you wanted to know about estimating, but were too afraid to ask. Before we jump into kind of what we're going to cover today, here's a quick little bit about me. I've been running projects for 16 years, 12 of which have been Agile projects across various sectors such as government, retail, telecoms, FS, and media and gaming. I've been at Kainos for 4 years, and I head up our consulting practice. So today we have a lot to cover. But not all that much time. So first off, we're going to talk about the universe and our place in it. We're going to talk about so what does all this mean? We'll explore a little bit about estimates and the problems with them. And basically, I would like everybody to leave this session with an idea of the pitfalls of estimates, some principles they can take away that you can take away and apply to your practice. And little bullets and tips on how to have difficult conversations with more senior stakeholders so that they use estimates that you provide them more responsibly. And we'll wrap up with the 6 laws of estimation. So, are you ready? Somewhere out there, right now, a project manager is compiling estimates on a software project and is deriving a completion date on one of these. So what? Well, when we approach projects with horrifically big Gantt charts and try to nail down everything with certainty, we end up in positions like this. I don't know if this is a documentary strip or if this is just the fantasy of the Dilbert creator, but here we go. A senior manager wants a budget estimate for a project but doesn't have a scope or design for it. Okay, my estimate is $3.5 million, but you don't know anything about my project. Well, that makes 2 of us. Or I'm getting wildly differing estimates for how long it will take to write the software. Based on my experience, I say take the longest estimate and multiply it by 3. Is experience the exact same as pessimism? Experience is much worse. I'm sure that as practitioners within this industry, we've all been there. I know I have, and it's kind of why I related back earlier to the time I've spent trying to deliver projects with this encumbrance of estimation as gospel. So here is a quick whistle stop with some of the problems with estimates. First off, at the beginning of a project, we know the least. And there are many, many elements of uncertainty, and we try to control these with RAID logs, so risks, basically. And we overlook the fact that there's uncertainty. We try to manage everything, document everything, and lock it all down. But, you know, as Clausewitz said, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Or as Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Things change. And based off that, we end up with a false precision. I'll be talking a little bit about precision and accuracy a bit later and how they're different. We get estimates by Fiat. Maybe you have had experience of senior management coming in and telling you to shave 3 months off that delivery estimate for something that you've planned out just because they can. At the beginning of the project, we know the least about the project. However, we seem to think that we're able to create perfect estimates at that point. We have cognitive biases as humans that convince us to maybe pad or alter estimates to suit maybe the environment we're in or the pressures we're under. And probably one of the worst things I've seen is an estimation handoff phenomenon. And that's where you have a team that will go ahead and create estimates and then will pass the responsibility of delivering against those estimates to somebody else. So you might have a senior architect estimate a load of requirements for a project and then hand them over to a team of doers while the architect moves on to the next project. Thankfully, I don't see this here at Kamos. And one thing to add about estimates is that estimation itself is a problem. Estimation, the act of spending time estimating a massive requirements list or backlog, that takes time. That's time that you're not spending actually delivering the thing. So why do we estimate? We estimate for planning reasons, because of course we need to have a rough idea of how big something is, how much it's going to cost when it's going to come in. We need to know when things are done. We need to know how many people to allocate to an endeavor. Sometimes we need to know who to blame. But the point of estimation is to support responsible decision making. So there are problems with estimates, but we need them because we need to be able to enable and support decision making. So how do we make estimates suck less? Possibly the people on this call, you're familiar with this Agile manifesto. This has been around for some time, coming up to 18 years now. And the Agile manifesto favors, there are 12 principles other than this, but there is a favoring of individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So favoring the actions and the work of individuals over, I have to follow this process. It favors customer collaboration, responding to change, and delivering working software. It's worth pointing out that the Agile Manifesto favors things on the left rather than insists on the things on the left instead of the things on the right. So a typical issue that I have, with advisory work that I do is sometimes people will say, well, Agile's rubbish because you don't document anything, because all you do is build software. It's not true. It favors working software. So along the same lines of the Agile Manifesto, I would like to suggest some Agile estimation principles. So first up is speed over perfectionism. So by this I mean, if we agree that estimating is time taken away from actually delivering software, and if we agree that estimates at the beginning of a project are going to be unreliable, then let's spend as little time deriving those estimates as we possibly can. And there comes a point where if you spend too long polishing estimates, you're not going to get any more perfect an answer than if you have a rough stab. The second is accuracy over precision, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So by this I mean favoring on the left, delivering estimates that give you a range, and we'll talk about that shortly, rather than a precise date. Collaboration over assertion. So let's collaborate as teams, as staff, as delivery practitioners, rather than having an estimate asserted to us by Fiat. And then finally, relative over absolute. There's very good evidence that shows that relative sizing is a much more reliable method of deriving estimates that bear out fruit in the long term. So a quick note on precision versus accuracy. In the past, I have built Gantt charts that look a bit like this. I've spent time walking around with these Gantt charts and ticking things off as done. So I've been there. And the reason I'm flagging this one up is there's a story of when I joined a company some time ago, and I was taking on a portfolio of projects, and I was working with somebody, new project manager, new to me anyway. We'll call him Bob. So I say to Bob, what are you working on? And Bob says, I'm working on this amazing new payment system. It will allow us to take more credit cards onto our system very, very quickly. That's brilliant, Bob. We were in March, by the way. And I said, so it's March now, when are we going live? And he said, December the 5th. And I said, that's brilliant, what time? And he said, that's a really stupid question. And I said, well, December the 5th is a little bit too precise of an answer. So what's it going to be? As it happened, Bob went live with his project on December the 5th, but delivered 50% more features. You could argue that perhaps the estimate was too precise, and therefore the scope was adjusted up to meet a precise delivery date. So that's false precision. Far better would be if Bob had said, okay, it's March, we're going to go live in financial quarter 3 sometime. And then as we approach the quarter, we're going to go live sometime November, December, I'm not entirely sure. And then as we approach December, we're going to go live sometime in December. We're going to go live sometime in the first half of December. Okay, we're going to go live in the first week of December. And as we get closer and closer, December the 5th. We still need to know roughly when Bob's going to go live, because we need to plan other activities, perhaps marketing, perhaps content changes, perhaps legal changes, sign contracts, whatever. But too precise an estimate can cause either feature padding or it can cause disappointment. So who should estimate? Should it be the product owner, the person who owns the budget? Should it be the Scrum Master? No, it should be the development team, and the development team should do this collaboratively, and they should be trusted with their opinions. Estimates should be relative. So estimates are usually wrong. And when we estimate, we should do it as quickly as possible. And so if we size relatively, we're able to see what our progress is against these relative sizes and replan. So we use quite often story points, or there are other techniques which we'll look at in a moment, but story points, for example, which allow us to see relative estimates and allow us to plan our progress through those estimates, and we'll talk about that shortly. It's also worth pointing out that for teams that use story points, we can't compare our teams. Story points are not a comparable currency. So here are 4 estimating techniques that might be useful. So easily the quickest and easiest to understand really is t-shirt sizing. Does that project, does that feature feel like an extra small or an extra large or an extra extra large? It allows us to quickly size our requirements or our features or our projects. Quite often this is used at the beginning of a portfolio organizing session. I think this project is an extra small project, and I think this project is an extra large one. And then it allows us to quickly sort. And whilst it's very, very fast, there is low fidelity to it. What do we mean by extra large versus extra extra large? It's kind of hard to say, but at least it's quick. We also have planning poker, which uses cards like this. Yeah, so teams will play planning poker. This eliminates, where possible, the human biases, because the process of playing planning poker allows us to keep our estimates to ourselves in group planning exercises until such a time as we're ready to show the value of what we estimate the story or a feature to be. It's good for avoiding something called the anchoring effect, where you may have a feature being estimated by a team and you have a senior person in the team speaking up and saying, well, that's really, really easy. A more junior person may be considering something the senior person hasn't considered and be afraid to say so or challenge. So at least then you can facilitate using these cards to better understand where some of those challenges aren't being raised. So there is great fidelity to this because you have quite a few different buckets that you can pick from in terms of your values, but it's a very, very time-consuming process. In the past, I've tried to size a backlog with a team, maybe several hundred stories of them, and that took a very, very long time. Sometimes planning sessions like this in planning poker can take hours and hours and hours. So another way of doing it is to use a bucket system, and I quite like this. You can quickly organize your various cards, your buckets, on a table, so from 0 to 100 or to 200, and then have your team relatively size your stories into those various buckets, and that gives you a nice way of sizing. And then finally, there's no estimates. No estimates is more for relatively advanced teams. No estimates favors minimizing estimation, sizing your requirements all to be roughly the same size in the middle of a project, and counting the number of stories or features that you deliver. So there are a few of these. I guess one of the things that I really want to get across is that you should listen to your teams. So some time ago, we were sizing a project when I worked in a different company. And funnily enough, it was another March time. And we were sizing a project out. It looked as though we were going to go live late, funnily enough, another December, January deadline. And I had a head of delivery come up and say, no, we've got to make it August. And I questioned this. I said, you want to shave several months off our delivery dates because of what reason? I didn't realize the politics at play at that point. So politics can come into estimation too. And so he insisted on pushing for August. And I said, you're going to burn out your teams here. We're still hiring to try and fill up the right number of teams. We had to hire 8 Scrum teams. You're going to burn them out. And he said, have you ever watched Star Trek? And I said, yes, I have, yes. And he said, well, you know, when people are playing, when people are fighting the Borg or the Klingons or whatever on the Enterprise, and the ship gets rocked with a laser barrage or whatever, and one of the consoles blows up in the face of the guy with the red shirt sitting at the front, and he slumps dead over the console. Yeah, I didn't really like where this was going. He said, well, that's how we're going to use our developers on this project. When each one gets burnt out, we'll swap them over for someone else. Don't be like him. Your developers aren't red shirts. Listen to your teams. Which takes me on to using estimates responsibly. So once you've understood the number of points or the size of the work that you're trying to deliver, you can work out how fast you're working your way through that work. So every sprint that you use, you'll get a number of story points that your team has delivered, and you'll have something called velocity. So your velocity is the number of points that a team has delivered in one iteration or one sprint. So you can use that for planning as well. If you have a set of features that you've sized and your total number of points is 1,200 for argument's sake, how many sprints of 2 weeks will it take to get through that 1,200 points worth of features? And this comes down to being able to give a rough idea of when you might be able to deliver. So at the beginning of a project, when you know the very least about what it is that you're doing and how fast you're going to be able to work through things, how do you estimate the speed at which you're going to get through that backlog of stories? How do you estimate? So there are 3 ways you can go about this. The first is running a few dummy iterations, or running a few iterations before you make any commitments to senior management, or as a senior manager asking that your teams run a few iterations before they make any commitments to you. So it's always the best choice. You have a team. Every time you develop software, you are possibly using a brand new team, possibly using a new combination of tech, and possibly working in a new problem space. So every project is a process of invention. So it doesn't make sense necessarily to try and estimate a velocity based off anything other than actual experience. So this is the most preferred way of doing it. The next most is if you have a team that is relatively static. That team has been together for a long time. They work pretty much in the same business domain and using the same tech stack. And somehow you can say, well, that team in the past has had a velocity of 50 points per sprint. So we can estimate based off that. It will be 24 sprints now. But what if you can't do any of those things for various reasons? Well, the least preferred option is to forecast what fits. So when the other options aren't possible, make up a velocity that you might use. Now, that is pretty dangerous, so I don't recommend it. Forecasting what fits, it takes us back into the realm of opening yourself up for pressure to make commitments, but this time you're doing it behind the veil of story points and with some form of science, which isn't there. So wherever you can, run iterations first for a couple of sprints and use that as a planning velocity later on. And I'll talk you through an example of that later. So when you're making commitments, it's worth bearing in mind the cone of uncertainty. So the cone of uncertainty is a principle in project delivery that is observed, has been observed even by vaunted institutions such as NASA, where planning at the beginning of a project gives you an outcome or a deadline or an estimate that is either 4 times too big or 4 times too small at the very beginning. At the very beginning of a project, you don't know anything. You don't know how fast you're going to work through things. But as you go through a project, it's worth re-estimating and reviewing your actual speed of getting through your requirements. So if you're a senior manager and you're being made promises at the very beginning of a project, please be skeptical and please challenge. And if you're a delivery lead and you're being asked to make commitments, have a look at the cone of uncertainty and talk through this with your stakeholders to try and explain to them that at the beginning of a project, this is when we know the least, but as we get closer to the end, that's when we know the most. So could we please at least work to that cone? So please don't be ashamed of uncertainty. Embrace uncertainty, because uncertainty is truth. If you're running a waterfall project where you've got everything locked down at the beginning because you've written a project initiation document, you've written 170 pages of requirements, you've done all of your systems architecture and everything up front, you've derived perfect estimates on a spreadsheet, and you're expecting still that you'll hit the right dates, you're not going to. And that's why, you know, traditionally waterfall projects will get buffered with some kind of contingency anyway. Except the difference is that with a waterfall project where we don't accept uncertainty, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment every time, because we'll learn about how far we've gone off track with our projects right at the end, possibly when it's a bit too late. So it's far healthier to embrace uncertainty from the start. So how do we work with uncertainty for planning purposes? Because of course, it's all very well me saying, let's accept uncertainty, but organizations are dependent on the things that come from our IT teams and from our digital delivery teams. So there are 3 possible ways you might want to manage this uncertainty. The first is to buffer for features. So over time, you will have a set of features being delivered. You will have a minimum viable product, which is represented by that black line. And you'll say, based on the progress of the jaggedy line, which is the speed at which we're creating features, based on that progress, we anticipate that we're going to have our features delivered by N date, between this sprint number and that sprint number. A very good way to buffer your features is also to say that only 70% of the features should be mandatory. So our minimal viable product that our team is working to should only really be 70% of the overall list of requirements or backlog. The other thing that you can do is schedule buffer. So this may seem a bit familiar to some of our, some of us with our waterfall experiences. Basically, put 20% onto the time, and if you deliver early, that's great. And then the final one is to deliver somewhere in a zone of features versus time, and we call that combined buffering. So to bring it to life here at Kainos, we deliver mostly projects into the public sector, and we follow the government digital service lifecycle for project delivery. So what we'll do in a project usually is a discovery of around 4 to 8 weeks, where we validate a problem. So is the hypothesis around which this project has been requested actually valid? And using user needs analysis and creating an initial backlog, we get a rough idea of where we need to focus our efforts. We also do some work to understand the technical constraints of what it is that we want to deliver. That takes us into our alpha stage, which is about 8 weeks. And the way we usually break this up is to have a 1-week planning, 3 2-week sprints, and a 1-week planning for beta. And in the alpha, we test and learn from some of the ideas that we've brought up in our discovery. So we'll try to we'll do some technical prototyping to understand if some of our integrations hold up. We will do mock-ups of prototypes and test them with actual users. Those mock-ups could be paper-based or whatever else, like HTML or Axia, and test them with users. And then we'll plan for the beta. But based on those 3 2-week sprints in alpha, we track a velocity. And using that velocity, we use that for planning our beta. And when we run our beta, we're able to use this planning velocity to set a pretty good, pretty accurate, not precise, forecast of where we're going to come in our delivery. So I'm going to close off gradually by talking you through also 6 laws of estimation that I can heartily recommend. So the first law of estimation is, if we were perfect estimators, we would be somewhere else. So the reason I have a Bitcoin ATM here is because some time ago I put £20 into a Bitcoin ATM and it spat out a QR code for me. That was in 2015. And I spent £10 worth of Bitcoin. So the remaining £10 worth became £500 worth at Christmas last year. So had I been a perfect estimator and had I had perfect sight, I would have bought as many Bitcoin as I possibly could, and I would be somewhere else. Much as I enjoy doing this webinar today, I would probably be on a desert island drinking cocktails. If we were perfect estimators, we wouldn't need to do what we do and we would be somewhere else. We're not perfect estimators. The second law of estimation is an estimate is a guess. It's a rough calculation. It's not a guarantee. The problem also with precise estimates is it gives a sense of full certainty to our stakeholders. A sense of full certainty where a precise number is derived, or a precise date, or a precise, even worse, date and time, where a senior manager may look at that and say, well, they've said December the 5th at 4 p.m. So they must know what they're doing. If we start a project from the very beginning and say, this is an estimate, which means, by the way, guess, because we haven't started the work yet, start that conversation early and try and help your stakeholders understand uncertainty principles. It's a guess, not a guarantee. Our third law of estimation is favor accuracy over precision. Talk about, as much as possible, quarters, ranges of months. We're going to have this done sometime between sprint 15 and 19, or 15 and 17 as you get nearer. Favor accuracy over precision, for the same reason that I've described the guess, not a guarantee. Keynes, possibly Carveth Reed, there is debate about this, said that it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. I couldn't agree more. The fourth law of estimation itself is a waste of time. It's always going to be a little bit wrong. So the best thing you can do is minimize the waste, and minimize the waste by using quick estimation techniques and helping your stakeholders understand the drift possible with the deadlines, so that you spend as much time as possible delivering actual value that gets confidence in your delivery abilities rather than managing a spreadsheet. The fifth law of estimation is bad news early is better than bad news late. It doesn't always have to be bad news, but far better if you manage expectations around uncertainty and talk about the ranges of delivery, so that at least the business or your clients that you're serving has the ability to change their plans in good time. There's nothing worse than a watermelon project. A watermelon project is a project that's green on the outside all the way through delivery, but when you cut it open at the end, it's all red on the inside, i.e. the rag is off. Far better to upfront have these conversations with stakeholders on your project and say, we think we'll be sometime in this range. Can we plan together to manage that uncertainty? The sixth law of estimation is just simply to embrace uncertainty. If you take nothing else away from today, please embrace uncertainty. So here are the laws. Just a quick note as I wrap, we're Kanos. We have offices across the globe. We have offices in Gdansk and in Frankfurt also, where we're growing quite fast. We deliver digital services to government and the private sector with a strong technical consulting and user experience basis. Thank you very, very much for your time today. I'm very happy to take questions at the end of this, and also we're offering free reviews of your portfolio and of your estimation and planning processes. So we have 3 spaces left, and it would be great to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kieran, for your presentation. And as Kieran mentioned, we are now going to start answering the questions that have been submitted so far during the presentation. But as a reminder, if you do have a question or comment for Kieran, please just type those into the questions pane on your attendee control panel. And Kieran, our first question here is, how do I encourage my senior stakeholders to consume estimates responsibly?
Yeah, so hopefully that's a thread that's been running throughout the entire presentation. Please encourage your stakeholders to understand at the very start that this is a process of invention. Software development is, by its nature, using possibly new combinations of technology because the technology changes, possibly in a new problem space, possibly with a new team. So for that reason, if your stakeholders are insisting on fixed dates, what's behind that decision? What can they change in terms of the scope that necessarily needs to be delivered? Do they understand that things are uncertain? I think one of the things that will definitely help is managing fear. Uncertainty is a fearful state to be in, especially if you're a senior stakeholder and you own the outcome behind a backlog or behind a portfolio. What can you as a delivery practitioner be doing to win that trust and to prove the momentum of what you're doing? So can you be demoing things early and quickly, and maybe using that discovery alpha process? What can you be doing that will win their trust in the fact that, yes, this is uncertain and they'll need to manage it?
Thank you, Kieran. And a couple of comments in regarding the different systems. The bucket system seems to be the most preferred system that's there, and saying that it, in their opinion, it is much better. On one of your earlier slides, you mentioned estimation by Fiat. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm not referring to the car company. I'm referring to maybe another word would be diktat, or just insistence. Fiat being will. So if you're a senior stakeholder and you decide that instead of the December deadline that you promised, we're going to do this by August, that is an example of estimation by Fiat. I want all of the scope and I want it earlier because I say so. It's not based on anything real, it's just based on one person's insistence.
Thank you very much for that clarification. And moving to the final question that we have in so far today, how can we be sure that our staff are not padding estimates to make sure they have an easy life?
Yeah, so I hear this one a lot. If they're your staff and they report to you, or you're senior in the organization and you've created a culture that hires those people, my view is that if you're a leader in an organization, the most important signals that you send to the organization are who you hire and who you keep in your organization. And if you're seriously thinking that the staff that you're hiring are padding, dragging their feet, in other words, I presume, then you're kind of implying that the people you've chosen to join your organization are lazy in some way. Why would you not trust them if you're hiring competently?
Thank you very much, Kieran. So that is all the questions that you have in today from your presenters. So it just leaves it to me to thank you for your presentation, but more importantly, to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave the webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. It's just a couple of really quick questions, so we would be grateful if you could keep your browser window open and complete that and provide your feedback for us. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours, which will include a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Kainos Software and our presenter, Kieran, thank you so much for joining us, and please do enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thank you.